That is an act of love, not war. There's many, many people
Yeah.
who thought the same thing and never found the courage to say, hey, um, I'm going to say something that's hard for me to say and is going to be hard for you to hear, but I hope that you listen to me anyway.
Welcome to the Product Quest podcast. Thank you for joining us on our journey to better understand innovation and product strategy. My name is Jan Wermuth, and joining me, as always, my co-hosts Jonathan Edwards and Scott Burleson. Today, we'll be chatting to a guy that calls himself a business punk. From what I can see, the emphasis is as much on business as it is on punk. Greg Larkin, welcome to the Product Quest podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Perfect. So just give kind of the listeners a bit of background on you. What I find really interesting is you predicted the subprime financial crisis. I think you were one of the first to publicly do so in 2006 when you worked as a director of product innovation at Bloomberg. You now advise companies such as Google, PwC, Uber, Sky, and other Fortune 500 companies to launch transformative products and empower entrepreneurs. You've also built what you call a vetted invite-only community of 200 business punks around the world called Punks and Pinstripes. Great name, by the way. And written a book that we're going to hint on in the podcast with the beautiful title, This Might Get Me Fired. All right, so let's start. And probably let's start where it really matters. What are some of the punk bands that you're listening to at the moment? Is there anything that is running on repeat or
What is running on repeat? Idols is always gonna get up there. I was just driving in the car for 6 hours 2 days ago.
yeah.
Um, Thunder Bitch, which is the band made by the Alabama Shakes lead singer Brittany Howard, was the punk band that she created after the Alabama Shakes.
Okay.
So that was on
Okay.
heavy rotation.
Okay.
Um, you're never gonna like sit in a car ride with me and have my Spotify playlist on without hearing some yeah yeah yeahs, probably some Iggy Pop,
Oh,
um,
okay. Oh, yeah. That's yeah.
probably also some Bad Brains,
Okay.
interspersed with lots of other things like Miles Davis, Charles Mingus, Led Zeppelin,
I am really
Just
coveting your Spotify playlist. I've been wanting
yeah,
that.
see, sounds like a good taste of music overall. So okay, perfect. All right, so now that we kind of got that clear, let's jump into the innovation stuff. So I first want to get into I think where I was really intrigued by what you've written in this link between innovation and kind of let's say punk or being like rebels that you probably also call them in a corporate context. And I want to read out just a little bit of text from the Punk and Pinstripes website, if you like. I think you've kind of like a couple of things that you believe in. I just want to read this out and then maybe get your reaction on this. So on that website, it says, we're the business leaders who aren't seduced by Davos, golf, and McKinsey. The tech bros, hashtag tech bros, hashtag girl boss, hashtag hustle culture, startup fraternities, and sororities were not for us. We're the rebels of business. We don't always blend in, but progress is impossible without punks like us. We're punk on purpose. So, can you elaborate a little bit? Why is progress impossible without punks? Why is it why is that necessary?
be I can't entirely elaborate in terms of why it's necessary. I can explain that I've never seen a meaningful inflection point in a startup or in a large company without someone who was very comfortable making others uncomfortable.
Okay,
Um,
yeah.
um, why they feel that way, or why certain people are born that way or wired that way, why there are some people who have a very hard time settling for a paycheck and a retirement fund,
Yeah.
um, why there are institutions that become bloated and complacent and settle for half-assed measures of innovation, why there are entire economies, especially in Europe, which are
Yeah.
completely starved of any entrepreneurship, any venture capital, and have these half-assed post-it note parties that are supposed to like satisfy an actual innovation sector. Why that exists, I don't know. Why there are people
Yeah.
who are born into those economies and born into those companies and are like, you know what? Not for me. Sorry.
Yeah.
Um, if it's uncomfortable for you to for me to call out the fact that you've become bloated and fat and
Yeah.
comfortable with things that you should be absolutely disgusted about.
Yeah.
If that upsets you that I'm calling that out, that you've become complacent, that a company like Credit Suisse has been living on life support for a hell of a lot and taxpayer life support for a lot longer
Yes.
than it should have
I
been.
am one of those taxpayers, by the way. But
Um,
and yeah.
like, if that makes you fat and happy, that's great, but it's not for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and every moment in my life where someone has been able to break through and build something and create an inflection point and create a sense of urgency in an institution that should feel it but does not have it.
Yeah.
Um, those people are punk. They're not seduced by they're very uncomfortable with the comfort. They're
Yeah.
very uncomfortable with the paycheck. They're very uncomfortable with the complacency. They're very uncomfortable with the you can coast as long as you don't agitate.
Yeah.
And they can't
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah.
They can't silence themselves. They have an understanding that there's something bigger
Yeah.
and that they're not going to spend their life being you know, smiling, and they'd be doing a disservice by like
Yeah.
grinning at the institution for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
Um, I'm one of them. I realize that when you take those people and you send them to the Deloitte Digital Innovation Summit or,
Yeah.
WPP or Ogilvy's like, here are the tech trends of 2029.
Oh, they love the yeah. Yeah.
And that's supposed to be the thing that feeds that fire in their soul, because everyone's walking around bumping into each other with a fucking VR set strapped to their head. Um, what tends to happen
Yeah.
is
But,
that they
oh my
walk
God, this
out
is
and
going.
they're
Yeah.
like, that
Oh, these
sucked.
events are gonna
I
happen.
they
Oh
I,
man.
I came to that and they force fed me this
Yeah.
bullshit technology that's not ready for implementation that solves no real problem except getting kids addicted to video games.
Yeah.
And um, what I really needed was solidarity with other people who are not
Okay.
comfortable,
Yeah.
who aren't complacent. That's really what I needed to find.
Yeah.
And when
I
they
can
find those
imagine this is
people and they
usually
band
not a
together, they create incredible
yeah.
breakthroughs. Always.
Yeah. I can imagine this position is usually you're quite alone. I'd say like it's
Yeah.
it's not that majority of the people that you're going to working with are feeling the same way as you just described.
You're not actually as alone as it seems.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, it takes one person who has the courage to be like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to apologize for being wired in this way.
Yeah.
And suddenly this contagion of courage starts to happen where everyone else who feels the same way but never had the audacity to speak up about it starts to
Yeah.
raise their hand, find one another. I call that punk sonar. It's
Oh,
hard
that's a
to
nice.
detect,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but when you are that, you have this way of finding everyone else who is that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and there are certain economies which have made that very difficult.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I happen to have been brought up in the United States and in New York in particular, where being a little bit of a freak is very celebrated.
Okay. Yeah.
Everything that make like when I grew up in New York City with the punk scene, everything that made me undateable in high school was very valuable currency in Lower East Side Manhattan in the punk scene.
Okay.
And I think in business punks, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Everything that makes you a bit of an outcast when McKinsey's in your office and gathering everything or everyone around the boardroom is very valuable currency inside of Punks and Pinstripes and inside of the business punk community.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so my goal has always been to make the people who create that valuable currency introduce them to one another and enable them to empower one another to do the best work of their life.
Yeah, that's nice. When do you think did you I mean, you mentioned kind of your punk youth kind of, but was that always something you knew you're wired this way? Like how do most people realize, or you in particular, that they are that they cannot just that they are wired that way as you described?
Um, I think what happens is you spend a lot of time, especially if you're driven and motivated and you kind of do these things that make everyone else happy, but they don't make you happy.
Hmm. Yeah. All right.
And um and that was true for me, like playing football as a kid and being pretty good at it. And I'm just like, yeah, but I don't give a shit. It's not me.
Yeah.
Um and I think that's a really common thread is just like outlierism.
Yeah.
Um, Outlier, when you talk about Malcolm Gladwell talking about it, it's like everyone loves it when you're an outlier. Not true. You spend a lot of time playing by yourself.
Hmm.
It can be very isolated and alone. But you also will eventually, if you're able to survive and realize that it's also your sort of secret sauce and this indispensable, unique asset, you do eventually find your other freaks. And it
Yeah.
feels great, and that becomes
Yeah.
your community.
Yeah.
And there's some people who sort of latch onto the trend of like, let's pretend we're weird. Um,
Which also is not gonna work for
and that's not real outlierism.
no.
That's capitalizing on a trend of like
Yeah.
entrepreneurs are sexy.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think that's really what it is, though. I think, I'm a really good friend of mine is Tanisha Robinson, who's the CEO of Brewdog USA. Um,
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
and she's like, yeah, it feels really good to get into trouble.
But they
It's
are like a
really
company that
good.
kind of almost purposely, though. I don't know, but I don't know them enough. You probably know them much, but they seem to have that character built in themselves now.
Yeah, but you back up a little bit. Like
Hmm.
Tanisha is a black, gay, more ex-Mormon who grew up in rural Missouri.
You're a
And
very
instead
typical
of
scenario. I mean,
Very.
I mean,
and
those are
who
dime a dozen. Yeah.
who
Yeah.
was like I get I understand that there's a path that I was born onto and that there's a place
Yeah.
for me based on all of the circumstances of my birth. I'm sorry, it's just not who I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, that's not an easy choice. That comes with a lot of frustration and anger, but you couldn't, you speak to Tanisha and she's a really good friend of Punks and Pinstripes, and she's like, I wouldn't have built all of these billion-dollar companies if I wasn't at a certain point able to be really comfortable being an outlier, moving into an industry which is very set in its ways, like beer,
Very traditionally.
where you're
Yeah.
either a lager lad or you're Heineken, or
Yeah.
you're like an IPA nerd. There's a certain demographic, and she's like, well, I think there is room for punk.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we can agitate. I think we can piss people off. I think we can do it in a way which makes it safe for everyone who hasn't had the courage or the empowerment or the community to make themselves heard and be the truest version of themselves. I think we can do it in a way where this brand is the pinnacle for them. It's a beacon for them.
Yeah.
Um, that's very common among business punks. That's not, and it means that most people are not business punks.
Yeah.
There are very few of them.
Yeah.
Because it's not for the faint of heart. You're gonna get the shit kicked out of you. You will not be invited to a lot of very important parties. Um, and at a certain point, you kind of reach this place where you're like, I don't want to go to your party. I'm making my own party.
Yeah.
Greg, I'll tell
Yeah.
you who you made me think about is the main character Peter from the classic movie Office Space, who Peter and his fellow engineers, they were all sort of they didn't like the system they were in, and they were sort of oppressed by having to do TPS reports, etc. And then he had this event when he was hypnotized, and all of a sudden he just didn't care anymore. And all his colleagues thought, well, surely Peter's going to be fired now. But like the exact opposite thing happened. Like the consultants that came in loved him. Like he told his boss, just forget it. I mean, he cleaned a fish on his desk. He started doing all these crazy things. And I think that movie, that's such a classic movie. And I think there's lots of people that are sort of wannabe punks, that we want to be Peter, and we want to clean a fish on our desk, and we want to cut our cubicles down. But I would ask you what stops us from doing that. But I think the obvious thing is fear of paying a mortgage or whatever. Yeah, there's financial implications. So so what does an aspiring Peter do? Or, that's got to be an extremely common situation. I mean,
Yeah, so there's a difference between being disgruntled and being punk.
Okay, yep.
And I think that's a very important distinction that maybe you're missing.
Okay.
Punk, in my view, is an act of love, not war.
Mm.
And in the movie Office Space, he literally wanted to burn the whole thing down. That's literally how the movie ends.
Right.
With the red stapler, if I recall correctly.
Right.
That's not what I'm talking about. I think punk is what I'm about to say is hard for you to hear. We happen to be in a situation which has gone from curious and interesting to urgent and important. And if we cannot get out of our own way and listen to the voices that exist, that have been pushing and have a clear path to make this place better, to make this place more reliable, more durable, more relevant, faster growing, we don't deserve to be here as an institution, and the consequences of inertia, of stagnation, are extremely dire. That is an act of love, not war. There's many, many people who thought the same thing and never found the courage to say, hey, I'm going to say something that's hard for me to say and is going to be hard for you to hear, but I hope that you listen to me anyway. That's not burn the whole system down. There's a lot of people who knew this and understood that the forces of obstructionism and complacence and politics and cultural whatever made it very hard to be that person and raise your hand in that way. And so they said nothing. And that was a disservice. That was an act of hate. Or certainly of negligence. I'm not going to be one of them. I think this can and should and deserves to be better for everybody. And it's going to be uncomfortable while we get there, but I'm prepared for that if you are. That's punk as hell. That's not, that's the Clash, in combat rock. Like, I'm going to say things about the state of the UK in the 1970s and the early 80s and Thatcherism that are absolutely true, that are going to piss a bunch of people off, but you'll remember me saying this. I'm not saying this because I want the whole thing to be burnt down. I'm saying this because there's something better. It's the difference between like the Clash and the Sex Pistols. The Sex Pistols had no higher calling of what they wanted the country to be. That was just like, let's burn the whole thing down. The Clash was like, we can do better than this.
So, being myself also Swiss, we have a tradition of consensus in Switzerland. And my question is, at what point do you think consensus should come into play when you have these kinds of relationships? Because if you're always positioning yourself with respect to others in being an outlier, being different and in opposition, I would say, then how do you actually at some point come together and get to some constructive decision?
Yeah, so I think being a permanent outlier isn't necessarily the goal. I don't know, does Switzerland have many punks? Does Switzerland have an entrepreneurial system that I can't think of a Swiss startup.
You can find them if you really carefully look. But it's
Well, we have old startups.
Okay.
Explain. I'm confused.
Well, we have a lot of very big companies, and unfortunately, like in a lot of countries in Europe, we have a lot of very old and still successful companies like Roche, Novartis, Nestle. I mean, the banks, you might like them or not, but I mean, they've been very successful. So I think the problem is we don't have necessarily any recent big unicorn startups. But I would also say that in Switzerland, we have a very, very active mid-sized enterprise level. So the society is mainly held together economically through a big group of mid-sized companies who will make some kind of tool that you've never heard of that's very specific, and or some coffee machine for specialists that you don't know very much about, but it's not like the Silicon Valley extremely impactful, worldwide impactful companies, but we've got lots of smaller companies that are the real tissue, economic tissue of the country.
Yeah,
This is
so
like the
the
Swiss
economy,
pride. Like it's
I mean, the economy that you're describing is very much a consensus-driven economy, and I'm not
yeah.
saying there's anything wrong with that. Um, I do think that you have companies within an economy like that are not allowed to die when they deserve to. Um,
Yeah.
I have no fight with Novartis. I have no fight with UBS. Um, uh, I think there's a place in this world for reliable, predictable, cash flow generative businesses that have operational excellence about solving a known problem with a known solution. You'll never, I don't, my bank account is at JP Morgan Chase because it works.
Yeah.
You know, there's something to be said for things that just aren't broken and don't need to be fixed. And um introducing innovation where there's no sense of urgency is not necessary.
Yeah.
If there's nothing broken, it's going to be very hard to break through the consensus agenda. And so, I mean, I'm in the United States right now, and we're about to go into an election year where all of the dysfunction
It's not really about
of
consensus
our
there.
complete lack of consensus is about
Yeah.
to be on very embarrassing naked display in front of the entire world.
Hmm.
And there's a very real possibility that a game show host wins the dysfunction Olympics here. I couldn't tell you who the Prime Minister of Switzerland is right now. I'm sure that you have all of your cantons that are going to vote, and you're going to have a bunch of referendums in those cantons, and I think that's
Yeah.
wonderful. Does it lend itself to, do I expect a Swiss company to create a new category that's never existed before that winds up, for example, displacing investment banking, an industry which is very slow, very technologically antiquated, incredibly relationship based, extremely political? If that were to come out of Switzerland, I'd be very surprised. I think
I think a
being
lot of people would be, yeah.
a Swiss ultra high net worth wealth manager or a Swiss M&A advisor probably means that any technological improvement is going to be consensus driven and within the rules of the financial institution that already exists. Something that everyone can rally around. There's something to be said for that, but at a certain point, does that mean that you're solving an important problem in the fastest, smartest, and cheapest way that you can? Probably not. Not always.
So I kind of I want to move on a bit more into your into the book. So this might get me fired, and I think there's a couple of things that I want to touch upon, and I think what I would really would like to get into is you have kind of, let's say, a sort of a framework. I think there is steps outlined in there. Maybe it's not a framework as you would describe it, but how to go about innovation. And I think it's really going about innovation also in the face of knowing that there is going to be resistance to it, that there's going to
Sure.
be either a consensus-driven call or just a complacent call, whatever you want to call it. But how to get over kind of innovation in the face of adversity or yeah, barriers that are just there. One of the beautiful barriers that you describe, I think it's in the preface, is internal politics, rather corporate internal politics. Or in my experience as a consultant, I think that is one of the biggest. That's one of the biggest hurdles to innovation that I've ever experienced. I've seen millions burned because of that. So what can you as an innovator do? How should you go, or how should you go about innovation in a context of where you very well know, hey, this is necessary. I think we have good reasons why we should do this, and how to go about innovation, how to move things.
That's a big question, but so look, I think there are a few. First of all, the timing of when innovation is appropriate. There are, in my view, really only a small handful of circumstances when you have a green light to innovate.
Yeah.
Um, and I call those the five crises. So one of those crises is a big earnings miss.
Yeah.
You know, the market, your company's financial performance is faltering. Number two, M&A. You've just been acquired. There's a new sheriff in town. They want you to do things better than you have done them. Another one is activist investors. And then
Yeah.
a fourth one is disruption. I do not mean that there's a new shiny toy technology that everyone's excited about. That is not disruption. Disruption is that a new entrant is using new technology or new business model to steal your market share in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
That's disruption. Five is proactive leadership. There's someone who makes a compelling case that it's better to go on offense before any of those crises emerge than to have to react on defense.
Yeah. Yeah.
If those five circumstances are not present, the odds of innovating in a way that is meaningful, that is going to bypass or be able to mitigate politics and resistance, it's just you're going to be relegated to very token, let's have a design thinking party with the same budget as the office Christmas party, and hope that it's like a cool, interesting prototype that's never been plugged into an actual technological stack.
Yeah.
So urgency is pretty important.
Yeah. I've almost felt like these five are almost like decreasing in frequency. So like the fifth one is probably rather rare, but these are like good moments where you have, or at least there is an opening, as it sounds, for innovation. Then what I found super interesting is then in the book you say, well, you've got 8 weeks. Basically, well, maybe that's an oversimplification, but you got 8 weeks, show it in 8 weeks that it works, or you should stop. Can you explain that a little? Why the emphasis on in 8 weeks? Or well, on
the greatest innovators inside of any kind of an enterprise environment are not the best technologists. They're not the best design thinkers. They're not the best strategists. What they are is the most bulletproof anti-obstructionists.
Okay.
Every company, the idea that everyone in an organization wants innovation to work is not true.
Yeah.
FOMO has to contend with FULP and FU pay me. So FOMO is fear of missing out, the fear that we will be disrupted if we don't innovate. FULP is fear of losing power. It's the driving force of obstructionism and
Very
obstructionists,
powerful thought, I
meaning,
think. Yeah.
and it's all the time, except in instances of urgency, more powerful than FOMO ever is, especially in industries and economies and companies that are really old and have never been disrupted before.
Yeah.
F you pay me is we have to defend every dollar we spend to the people who own our company, the banks, the investors, the people who literally their only ambition is to put the teachers of the pension fund of the state of Florida or the government employees of France. The only reason they are putting money in our company is so they can retire on time. They don't give a shit about innovation. Their only objective is, or they do care a little bit, but what they really care about much more is being able to retire and with the money at their disposal that they were promised.
Yeah.
And so because of FULP and FU pay me, like you're gonna encounter so much obstructionism as an innovator. And I think that's really the biggest difference between the innovation observers and the innovation survivors. The people who observe it from the outside and like IDEO and McKinsey and Accenture, they haven't necessarily lived with the reasons you have to innovate, and they haven't necessarily lived with some of the challenges that make innovation fail. They've looked at it from the outside, but they haven't had those like FULP meetings or the FU pay me meetings where it's like, I don't care about your innovation. Where's my money? I
Yeah.
don't care about the blockchain. I don't care about AI. I care about putting my retirees into a nursing home. That's all I care about. Um, I don't care about your innovation. I'm going to be going from a senior vice president to a managing director, so you can kiss my ass. Don't
Yeah.
stand in my way.
Yeah.
That happens a lot more than someone
Yeah.
who's like, hey, look at this. What if we just rethought who our ideal customer is and what's their pain point? And I got a canvas. Let's fill out a canvas. Take that to the person whose obsession is FULP. Take that to the person whose obsession is F you pay me and throw the business model canvas at them and see what comes back.
It sounds like there has been some experience where you had kind of some of these experiences. I think there was so I recommend to everybody listening, you have a newsletter that you're more or less regularly write, but
Yeah,
I think
every
it's on
week.
Punk, so it's every week. I really recommend it. And I don't remember now. You had another acronym where you described such meetings. I think it was a couple of weeks ago where you go in and the other guy just doesn't care at all. The only thing he cares about is like, how can I make money off of this? And if you've got 5 seconds, like I think it was something like you got 5 seconds, asshole, or something like that.
Oh,
Was in like something like
that was
that.
actually
But
a
a
real
meeting like
story.
that.
I know the story you're talking about. What's my trade, asshole?
Oh yeah, exactly. What's my trade,
Oh
asshole?
man. So can I tell that story?
Of course.
So when I'm going to say 27 or 28, I was the head of banking analysis for this investment research startup called Innovest. That's where I predicted the collapse of the
Yeah.
subprime crisis. And and right as our prediction, which I published the research saying it was going to, I think this is going to be it's a bubble and it's going to collapse and it's going to be huge when it fails. Right as that research, like initially no one cared, but then over
Mm.
time, as like Bear Stearns collapsed and then HSBC had a few funds that broke, and so people were like, huh, who did anyone see this thing coming? And then we had a lot of our clients who were in Europe were like, who is there anyone? And so I was on my first roadshow to like a bunch of hedge funds in Europe. And one of my first meeting was with this guy called Eric Schott, who is or I shouldn't say Schott, it was Scott, because he was
Ah,
Dutch. He was the
okay.
head of he was a portfolio manager at APG, which is the big Dutch pension plan. And he was one of the most feared people in British and not in British, in European finance at the time. He was like just like shaved head, angry dude. And he shows up to my meeting. I like flew from New York to Amsterdam, and I had like 2 days of meetings, and then I'm flying back. And my son, who's now 16, was just born. So like
Okay.
it was an intense. Anyway, I sit down. He comes into the meeting 45 minutes late. This is before the iPhone, so he still had a Bluetooth headpiece in his ear,
Mm. Yeah.
and it
Okay.
was, and he has a BlackBerry. And he comes into the meeting, and I'm like, "Oh, hi, nice to meet you." Nothing. He doesn't talk. He sits down and he says, "Start." And I said, "All right, well, thanks so much. Well, these are some of the headwinds that I think your like banking industry is facing, and this is what I think are some." And he's like, "Stop. The market closes in 42 minutes. What's my trade, asshole?" And I'm like,
Okay.
that was it. And I said, uh, okay. And I just like went through my 30 slides and got to the last slide. And I said, I think Lehman Brothers is going to collapse, and I think Citigroup is going to survive, but it's going to be very difficult. And he said,
Yeah.
that's what I think too. Thanks for your time. Gets up, shakes my hand, leaves the room. Meeting
Meeting
adjourned.
done.
Thanks for flying over here.
Okay. Okay. Well, that way, okay. I mean, how do you feel about something like that? It must have been a very out of world experience.
Um,
Okay.
I, I kind of, so at the time I was terrified because APG
Yeah.
was also had a venture capital arm that was the biggest investor in Innovest.
Yeah.
So like if he left that meeting thinking these guys are wasting time, this analyst
Yeah.
doesn't know what he's doing. Or I didn't like his attitude even.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Yeah.
that has ramifications for my whole company just because they were not just a client, they were also an investor.
Yeah.
Um, which, by the way, being a banking analyst during that time was very difficult because I'm the first one to predict the collapse of the banking crisis, like of all the major banks. But all the banks also had asset management arms that were our biggest customers. And so if they didn't like what I said, there's regulations to prevent that, but they all just stepped on the regulations and would be like, yeah, we don't care. We've never gotten caught.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was hard. How do I react? I was terrified. I thought it was horrible.
Uh-oh.
And then I'm like, God, man, I wish I had just punched him in the face or something. Like, man, I had that like thing that happens when someone treats you like shit, and then after they leave the room, you're like, man, fuck him. This is what I should have said. And you start like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
having some
It's
like
always
weird
too late.
revenge fantasy. It sucked. I hated Eric Shot.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think, I mean, I've never not come anywhere close to an experience like that. But I think these, I remember distinctly a meeting I had it's well, okay, let me back up a little bit. It sounds very often that one of the important things is daring to speak the truth. So whatever then kind of the consequence, or maybe not whatever the consequence, but it seems to me like that's often connected to what you're saying. And I remember quite well a meeting, or there was a big like strategy workshop, blah blah blah, and of an innovation I at least personally cared about, but I was there as a consultant and I didn't speak up. And I remember it to this day. I knew they were going into the wrong I thought they were going in the wrong direction. I didn't speak up because I wasn't as senior and other circumstances. And I remember this meeting to this day, and I've kind of sworn myself never again that kind of I will never not speak up because I just cannot let it go. So and I feel like these are moments that somehow you need to make this experience. Okay, as a consultant, you're always anyway not that involved, let's say. So you have this kind of fallback, or you're not that don't have that much skin in the game. But it sounds like I think a couple of these experiences where you regret what you have done or you didn't speak up can also empower. Or is that not something? Well, or at least they are a lesson that you kind of need to learn.
It's really good data.
Yeah.
I think one of the key ingredients of punk is that you feel like shit about and you feel shame and remorse about all the times where a situation required someone to be a little bit punk rock and speak truth to power, even if
Yeah.
you were not powerful.
Yeah.
And when you have to live with the regret of keeping your mouth shut in those moments, um, that's I think great business punks have a lot of those. And at a certain point, they just don't do it anymore. And they don't necessarily do it in the office space way where it's like, great, let's light the building on fire. There's a really tactful way to say it, which is like,
Yeah.
if I'm going to say something that might be, maybe I'm not permitted to say, and I might get myself in trouble, but this is how I see it.
Yeah.
And, if I'm wrong or if it bothers you or if I'm offensive, then I'm prepared to live with the consequences, but I know I'd regret it if I didn't open my mouth
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
When you kind of preface it like that,
Comes from a different place. Yeah.
you're not saying it like I'm saying this because I want Bob to get fired because I want Bob's job.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Which sometimes happen.
happens all the time. And the assumption when you speak up is that it's entirely politically motivated.
Yeah, of course.
You're just doing this because you're some mercenary. That because very often it is. People throw other people under the bus all the time.
Yeah.
You happen to live in a country where people can't get fired, so it helps. But
Well, not as
Not true.
easily as in the UK.
so
Yeah.
they might not get promoted, but they won't get fired. In our
It
country, if you
takes a
want to
little bit
fire
more to
someone, you just have to be like, yeah, I didn't like his tone.
uh,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, I
So
don't know.
so I wanna talk about one other topic. So these were I really recommend the book. There's a couple of those situations in the preface and then throughout the book where I think it's valuable even if you haven't had the experience to learn from them. But there's a couple of concepts that are really really important. I think you mentioned this concept of a godfather, for example, that innovation just needs. So somebody who kind of has a strong back and protects innovation. But
Sure.
I want to move to the topic a little bit of, let's say, the state of innovation today. So, in my experience, at least, is that it's quite a hard time for innovation, or at least for what corporates have created, which are these innovation labs. So somehow I feel like 10 years ago we or I don't know what we started creating these labs and we kind of externalized or formalized innovation. I don't know exactly what these labs sometimes did, but they did stuff. And now it feels like a little bit of a reckoning. Like they are getting cut, they're getting what happened? So, or how do
What
you,
stuff did that you just answered your own question?
okay, yeah.
I don't know
Yeah,
what these labs did, but they did stuff. No, no, no. If you don't know what they did, they should have never been created. Like, I'm sorry, but like, if you're in the M&A advisory business of a bank, you don't do stuff. You create deals. Like, you're putting points on the board. You're generating revenue.
yeah,
What is
yeah.
the stuff of an innovation lab? Is it just a cost center? Like,
I think
is
sometimes
it a
developers.
science experiment?
Yeah,
Is it supposed to sort of fill the role that used to be played by DARPA and various like R&D arms that were just pure research of the government? Like I can understand how, to your example, like Novartis, like they have a very rigorous system for
yeah,
experimentation and failure, and they understand that there's a certain number of molecules that will be able to go into production as a drug. And they're going to make and if that happens, it's a blockbuster drug, and they will enjoy some degree of a monopoly on it for a regulated amount of time.
yeah,
Um, I don't understand what the fuck the Volkswagen Innovation Lab was doing. I met the people who I used to know worked very closely with the Ford Innovation Lab.
Hmm.
Do you know what they did? I don't.
I don't know
What
about
were
that
they
case, but I
creating
know about labs
prototypes
that,
of cars,
yeah,
or were they putting
yeah,
like the Mach-E into production so that it actually was a meaningful source of income for this company? It was a car that could remain competitive.
yeah,
A good innovation in a company has to strike the right equilibrium between, like I said, FOMO, FULP, and F you pay me.
yeah,
It has to be earn investor defensible. Has to be.
yeah,
It has to be innovative enough that it can remain modern and compete with people that don't have the same FOLP constraints of a bunch of political animals that don't give a shit about innovation. They just want a promotion.
yeah,
And if you play it right, the pressure that you have from investor defensibility and bullshit internal politics of people trying to protect their status and protect their budget, those sources of constant, incessant pressure
yeah,
can be the thing that hardens your innovation and makes it more viable to operate in the real world than anything else. It's not a mistake that AWS came out of Amazon.
yeah,
That
yeah,
didn't happen in an innovation lab. That happened because Amazon ran out of space to store and analyze its data. And everything in the fledgling industry of cloud computing at the time was too scientific, couldn't handle its volume, couldn't be done cost effectively, couldn't be done with a level of accuracy that they needed. So they built their own. And once it worked for them, they sold it to everyone else, literally everyone else who had the same
yeah,
problem. That's innovation. That wasn't isolating AWS from the pressure of commercial constraints.
yeah,
No, that was capitalizing on the real pressure of commercial constraints that Amazon was suffering from to pressure test it and make it better and more viable than every other product out there, trying
yeah,
to do the same thing.
yeah,
Um, and so I think the minute you sort of create an innovation lab, what you're actually creating is these shiny toys that mask the darkest, deepest corporate dysfunction. You're saying, in effect, we innovate in this tiny lab because we've figured we can't innovate anywhere else. We give up.
yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's
And
yeah, sorry, go on.
it's a contentious opinion, um, but I don't see it working anywhere else.
Mm,
Alphabet X is about to shut down.
yeah.
And if I can be so bold, like, what do you have an employee like Sam Altman, and because the only area that's actually innovating in a meaningful way in the entire juggernaut called Google is creating like self-driving cars and spaceships to create internet connectivity from space.
Yeah.
You're saying to someone that does something as sort of mundane as AI, like, yeah, you know what? Can we just throw you on like a dev team that's helping build our search product, and can you do some QA testing?
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
You have some understanding of like this thing called generative AI. That's cute, but like we let the people who are in the innovation lab deal with the experiments.
Yeah.
Like you're here, so can you just be an order taker, not an order maker?
Yeah.
Of
The,
course he
the,
left.
yeah.
And he went on to build the thing that is the biggest, like if you haven't noticed, if you use GPT-4 right now and it doesn't know the answer, it says searching through Bing.
Yeah.
You think that doesn't pose an existential threat to Google? If you
I
fast
sure hope
forward
so.
in
Yeah.
5 years from now,
Yeah.
you might have a very different statistic about the number of searches that go through
Yeah.
Bing versus Google.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
Um,
other thing that's interesting about these innovation labs is that somehow you're creating an isolated entity that's going to build some kind of, hopefully, some kind of innovation. If you're a venture capitalist, you benefit from the parallel processing of all these different companies who are building all these different ideas that you can pick from, and you have a portfolio of a lot of different companies that you can invest a little bit in and diversify your risk. But if you're a company with an innovation lab, you're basically all in on this one independent entity, and so it seems to me a bit like the worst of both worlds, because you don't benefit from the diversification you might get as a venture capitalist, and you don't also make use of your competitive advantage, which is the whole company you have around you and the expertise you have around you in a given space. So I kind of find it a bit an awkward situation. My question would be then, so what should one do if we don't do innovation labs? For one, I'm not sure that simply talking about culture change and saying everyone should become a punk would work. So what is like the pragmatic approach if you have a big company and want to create more innovation?
Yeah, so we did a big piece of analysis called the Corporate Innovation Genome Project, which looked at we tried to do the 200 largest incubated products from the Fortune 500. That information is so opaque and hard to find that we had to stop after 50. And basically, we wanted to look at every homegrown product that made it to $100 million in revenue in under 2 years inside of the Fortune 500. And then just ask a very simple question. Where did it start? How did it get built in the first place? And really what emerged were three innovation models. The two most successful innovation models we gave them stupid academic names, but they weren't stupid. They were accurate, but nerdy. So one of them was supplier substitution innovation. That's AWS. We want to capitalize on this emerging technology that will be useful for us. We're looking for a good vendor. We can't find one. So we're going to incubate our own. And once it works for us, we're going to turn it into a profit center. That was actually something like 24 or 25 of the products that we discovered. Next was cost center monetization. So I'll explain what I mean by that. So one of the company that acquired my startup was RiskMetrics. RiskMetrics began its life as a perk that was given to trading clients inside of JP Morgan. So if you traded through the broker-dealer desk of JP Morgan, they threw in this thing called RiskMetrics, which essentially was a way of assessing how much capital you had to set aside based on the amount of risk you took on every day in your trading desk. Ethan Berman inside of JP Morgan said, this is such a valuable, like people are more dependent upon the RiskMetrics like freebie that we throw in than they are on the services we're using to like match buyers and sellers. What if we spun this out and started charging money for it? So like that, and MSCI was another product that originated as a perk inside of Morgan Stanley. Those like cost center monetization, that was the other huge business model that worked the best. Things that you do for free to add value to customers, where if you start charging money for it, it's both extremely innovative and fast growing. Holt inside of Credit Suisse, rest in peace, was a system that did that. That was this really cool big data aggregation system that Credit Suisse used in the asset management team to get like a first draft. Here's the valuation of these stocks based on the data that we have access to. And they started selling that as a subscription service. I have no idea what happened to Holt, but 20 years ago when I entered investment banking, Holt was like That was always where you started first. Um, and then so there was about another 20 of the innovations we evaluated were based on cost center monetization. And then the final category was innovation labs. That was the lowest
Oh,
number of high growth products.
okay,
That
but
was
still
like,
in there.
sure. No, like there are products that emerged. A lot of the interesting is a lot of the products that came out of innovation labs failed when they were floated outside of the organization because they were so
Yeah.
heavily subsidized by the company. They were protected from market forces that were high pressure. They were also protected from political forces inside of the organization. So like Waymo didn't succeed when it was taken
Yeah.
out of Google. I don't even know if it may or may not still be around, but it struggled for a very long time and isn't really winning in the autonomous race. That's a very common story.
But somehow, if I look at those three categories, it seems to me that the innovation lab somehow is of a different type than the two first ones. Because the innovation lab is a kind of, I don't know what you would call it, strategy, tactic, whatever you prefer, to get to some kind of new product or service that you might be able to monetize. The two first ones are kind of retrospective in terms of how did we get to some result, and would be a product that you could monetize. What happens in a company if there is no supplier innovation and there is no cost center freebie stuff that they've invented? Then would you
Meaning
have
that they
an
just want to
innovation
create,
lab or?
meaning that they just want to create a new product and incubate it and build it from scratch.
Well, that's what I mean. I think the last one is slightly different in the sense that it comes previously in the process. In the two first categories, you already have some kind of innovation that's
Yeah.
happened and that you're kind of pushing to
So I think
monetize.
launching a new product is different than an innovation lab. I've launched products my whole career. Um, and that's very healthy. There's an expectation when you launch a product outside of an innovation lab that you're able to grow it and make money from it. Um, you're on the clock. New products don't have
Yeah.
like all of this padding to protect it. Um, Corporate product managers have very difficult, high pressure jobs. Um, and and sometimes your job is to create new features for existing products, and sometimes your job is to incubate something from scratch. Um, is there like a governance, role, or an operational sort of framework where that for new products to have the best governance system? I think so, but I think I think what happens in an innovation lab is like this is where we experiment with new technology. And I think what happens in a new
Mm.
product is like we have to get this right. Like
Yeah.
we have to, and we have to there's a way in which you do it so that it's uh
Well, I mean, if we take the like, not every company develops an AWS.
sure.
It takes a certain, call it whatever, like culture or sort of processes in place that make it such that Amazon, and
Oh,
that's not the only innovation they've done, such that
sure.
they're creative. But
Yeah.
so I would imagine that a lot of companies that won't even come up with these supply substitution or innovations, they won't even come up with that. So what can these companies do to be better at that?
Again, I think it comes back to what I was talking about before. Like, is there real urgency?
Yeah.
Um, what are the economic hurdles that you have to clear to have like good stage gates that are economically viable? And how do you build infrastructure in it where you can be an anti-obstructionist? How can you anticipate that there's going to be political resistance
Yeah.
simply because it's new and people feel threatened by it once it starts to work? The biggest fights I've ever had were not from the products that failed. They were from the products that won.
Yeah.
Because people believed that I was stealing budget and trying to eclipse them, and they got jealous that I was invited to some bullshit charity gala with the CEO or whatever. Um, those are
Yeah.
honestly the political fights that are much harder to navigate
Yeah.
um, than building something where there's just not really any technical or market validation or economic validation. That's a fact of life. If you're going to launch new businesses in a new company, invalidation is just a feature. Having validation and failing because of politics and failing because of a complete disinterest in economic investor defensibility, to me, that's not a good enough of a reason for failure, but it's probably the most common cause.
Yeah. So I know we're gonna bring
I have to
this to
wrap,
an end a
yeah.
little bit. Yeah. So, but what I really think is a message worth taking away here is kind of don't take the pressure of innovation. If you do that, it's good that there's some pressure there, or it's even you need some pressure behind it. Otherwise, why should it matter, right? Then we can do it or not, or but so
Yeah.
okay. So well, the book is This Might Get Me Fired. There is, of course, your personal website. If you Google Greg Larkin, you will find it. There is the Punk and Pinstripes website. I think that's Punk and Pinstripes in one word.
Punksandpinstripes.com is the one that I actually invest the
That's where
most
the people
in.
should
I
go
would
to.
go there, subscribe to the newsletter, and check me out on LinkedIn. Follow me on LinkedIn.
Okay, that's perfect. Do you have time for one little question before you go?
Go.
No?
Real quick.
Okay, real quick. So let's imagine I'd pay for a screen on Times Square for one day, and I would give that screen to you. What would you show? What will be on the screen?
Holy shit! Wow.
That's always the toughest question in the end. But
What would a punk do? Just break the screen, right?
Yeah. Punk is an act of love, not war. That's my screen.
Oh, that's perfect.
Nice one. Very
Perfect
nice.
place to end this. So thank you so much, Greg, for taking the time. Thank you for staying a little bit over. And that concludes today's Product Quest podcast. So please send any comments or ideas for future shows to productquestpodcast@gmail.com, and see you next time.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you, Greg.
Have a good one.
Bye. Bye-bye.